Yeah, okay, so let's get to where I wanted to start the discussion,
All
which
right.
was a surprising legacy in our Jewish liturgy of the Book of Lamentations, known in Hebrew as Echa. So many of the texts of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, are known in Hebrew by the first words, or the first prominent word. And the first prominent word for the Book of Lamentations is Echa, which can be interpreted as oh woe, alas. It really means how, the exclamation, how desolate is the city, how destroyed is this city. So sometimes we call it Lamentations in English, sometimes it's Echa. In Greek versions of the Bible, it's threnoi, from the Greek threnody, which means a dirge, a lament. We have in Jewish liturgy a surprising inheritance from the Book of Lamentations. We know that Lamentations forms the central core, of course, of the liturgy for Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, the day that commemorates the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, and, by the way, a whole lot of other things in Jewish history, as Jeff Lerner talked about and as Mike talked about the other night. So Echa is not the only text, but the central, kind of the spine of the Tisha B'Av liturgy. But there is another passage from Lamentations, just one line from Lamentations, that appears over and over again in Jewish liturgy. And because it's liturgy, nobody pays any attention to what it says. Nobody pays any attention to what it really means. We just sort of take it for granted. We chant it, we say it, we sing it. And we don't think about where it comes from. Most people who go to a synagogue on a regular basis and recite this line in service after service after service have no idea where it comes from and never think to associate it with Echa, with Lamentations. And I think I will present it for you. Let's see if I can share my screen for a moment, if I can find this text and share my screen. And as soon as I sing it, you'll recognize it. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu kekedem. Or in English, renew our days as of old. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Chadesh Yameinu, renew our days as of old. What in the world is that doing at the end of every Torah service? And then, of course, again and again through the month of Elul, in every Selichot, every penitential service, and again on Yom Kippur. Well, what's fascinating about this is that the ancient, not so ancient, but the rabbis, at least in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, who compiled our Jewish liturgy, plucked that text and stuck it at the end of the Torah service, giving it a completely different slant from the one that it has in its original position, which is the next to the last verse of the whole book of Lamentations. This is Lamentations chapter 5 or book 5, verse 21. Next to the last verse. When we get it in the Torah service, what it seems to mean is something like, God, you've been with us through your words of Torah. Come back soon. Come back soon to us, and we'll be near to you again. Restore us to the, restore us to the ancient close relationship that we once had when the words of Torah came from you to us so generously and so frequently. That's what it seems to mean at the end of the Torah service. When we get to the Slichot services for Elul leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it seems to take a different tone. And indeed, it usually has a different melody. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Eleh. It's a pleading. It's pleading. We have not always up to what we should be doing, and it feels as if you have drawn away from us. Come closer to us, welcome us, and we will make the effort to come closer to you and renew us, regenerate us, restore us to a healthy, pure, complete relationship with you, O God. But look at where it comes. This is Lamentations. Lamentations is in 5 chapters or 5 books. This is the last of them. This is the 5th. And we're getting very close to the end of Book of Lamentations. The last chapter has 22 verses. So here we're starting in Lamentations 5:15. Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing is turned into mourning. I wonder if does anybody catch the other biblical reference there? Our dancing is turned into mourning. It's a play on Psalm 30, verse 2. God, you have turned our mourning into dancing. This flips it around. Now our dancing is turned into mourning. The crown, the crown of God's favor has fallen from our head. Woe to us that we've sinned. We are heartsick, our eyes are dimmed because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate. Jackals prowl over it. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures through the ages. Why? And look at this verse that comes right before Hashivenu. Why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Hashivenu, Adonai. Elecha, take us back to yourself. And then the last verse, actually, this is why when it's read in the synagogue, we read through verse 22 and then loop back to verse 21, because we're not supposed to conclude a reading with a negative thought, with a sign of favor. Instead, we should emphasize God's favor. So typically, we read, take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old, for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. And that's where the book of Lamentations ends. Bam! Rejected us, bitterly raged against us. But then we circle back. Hashivenu. Take us back, O Lord, yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old. One of the things that this means, by the way, in regard to the singular aspect of Lamentations, is that unlike almost every other book of the Tanakh, of the whole Hebrew Bible, we have a very narrow window in which to date the composition of Echa, right? Because it cannot possibly be any earlier than 587, destruction of the temple, and it surely must have been completed within the next 50 years, because 50 years later, exiles from Babylonia were returning to Jerusalem to begin the task of rebuilding the city and rebuilding the temple. So Echa has to be dated in that 50-year period, and probably earlier rather than later, because the whole tone of all of these verses is desolate. We are lost. We are forsaken. You have turned away from us. You have drawn away from us, O God. And we are desolate. We don't know what we're going to do. Our hearts are sick. Jackals, foxes are prowling in the precincts of the temple. So why, we might ask, was the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem such a big deal? Yes, we understand it was a great city that was destroyed. Major building, the temple, was destroyed. I think we appreciate the significance of Tisha B'Av best when we think back to the Torah and remember that the whole Torah seems to be leading up to our possession of the land of Israel, our settlement in the place that God has designated for us, Yerushalayim, and the concentration of worship in the place that God has designated for our sacred service to God. And now that's destroyed. So it's as if the whole thing that the Torah was about has suddenly become dust and ashes. It's all fallen to pieces. All of Jewish history up to this point was leading up to the foundation of a mighty city in Jerusalem and a great temple in Jerusalem to which all the world would come and pay tribute, and God's word would go forth from Mount Zion. Now, God is still there. You, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures through the ages. Echa says in verse 20 of the 5th book, you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures through the ages. So God is still there, but now there's no downlink. You know, if we think of the temple in Jerusalem and God's throne somewhere out there, wherever, or in there, wherever, and there's a kind of dynamic communication between God and us, with God being, so to speak, the uplink and us being the downlink. Now the downlink is gone. We don't have the temple. We don't have access to that form of communication with God. And what is remarkable about Lamentations as a book is that in the midst of this catastrophe, something has remained. And what has remained is, of all things, art. Because the Book of Lamentations consists of 5 immaculately crafted, extravagantly organized and designed poems. That's what they are. They're poems. They're not really speeches. This is poetry, and poetry of a particular kind. Threnoi in Greek, kinot in Hebrew. And these poems fall into a known genre of ancient Near Eastern literature. And it's a genre of the lament for a destroyed city or a destroyed monument of some sort. But in virtually all the other instances, the lament or poem of mourning also records the fact that it's been rebuilt, it's been restored. This does not. But instead, what it gives us in these 5 poems is a work of art that suggests the possibility of finding a way to contain all of that grief, all of that sickness that afflicts the soul of the people. And it's done through, of all things, poetic technique. Of the 5 poems in Lamentations, 4 of them are acrostics of the Hebrew alphabet. An acrostic is a text made up of in which the initial word spells out something. And in the case of Lamentations, these are acrostics of the Hebrew alphabet. So the first line of the poem begins with an aleph. The second line will begin with a bet, the third line with a gimel, and so on. In the middle of those 5 poems, we have a triple acrostic, 3 aleph lines, followed by 3 bet lines, followed by 3 gimel lines, and so on. Just to give you a sense of this, here is the beginning of Lamentations. And at least in this case, for the first 2 verses, the translator has made an effort to imitate in English that technique, beginning the first line with alas, the second line with bitterly, in other words, A, B, corresponding to the aleph bet. Echa yashva badad, ha'ir rabati am, hayta ka'almana rabati, v'goyim satai, v'midenot hayta lamas. V'cho piryichye v'layla, v'dimatya alecha, en la minachem, b'choi veha horeha, agadel du, hayula lei. Alas, lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her. Of all her friends and all her allies, they have all betrayed her. They have become her foes. That's a typical Ashkenazic way of chanting Echa. The Sephardic melodies are different. So you see Aleph for the first line, Bet for the second line, and so it goes, Aleph through Tav. And then we get to Lamentations chapter 2, and there it is again, Echa. Echa, how the Lord in his wrath has shamed fair Zion. Or as the translator has it here, alas, the Lord in his wrath has shamed fair Zion, has cast down from heaven to earth the majesty of Israel. Echa, Bila, Aleph, Bet. He did not remember his footstool on his day of wrath. The Lord has laid waste without pity all the habitations of Jacob. He has raised in his anger fair Judah's strongholds. He has brought low in dishonor the kingdom and its leaders. Then we get to chapter 3, the middle of these 5 chapters. And this one suddenly shifts to first person singular, I. The melody, as it's traditionally chanted, also changes somewhat. And now, instead of a single acrostic, as you see here, it's a triple acrostic. Ani, Oti, Ach. Each of the first 3 lines begins with the letter Aleph. And then the next 3 lines begins with the letter Bet, and so on through the Aleph Bet, down through Tav. A dirge, a personal lament of 66 lines. And here we see an interesting bit of the artifice of the poem, which one doesn't really get, I think, unless somehow you have access to the Hebrew. Ani hagever ra'ani. Ani hagever ra'oni. The first word, I, ani, Aleph, Nun, Yud. That means I, first person singular. I am the man who has known affliction. But the word affliction in Hebrew is known oppression, suffering. The word affliction in Hebrew is ayin nun yud, spelled and pronounced very similarly to ani, I. So what the text seems to suggest is I and affliction have become virtually identical with one another. I have become affliction. Affliction and I have become one and the same thing. And so chapter 3 is the personalized first person singular song of unrelieved mourning. And each of these verses, each line of this poem is shorter than the lines of chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 4, we're back again. Echa. How the gold has become dulled. Alas, the gold is dulled. The finest gold, the sacred gems are spilled at every street corner. The precious and we're thinking, gold? What's all that about? The precious children of Zion. B'nai Tzion, once valued as gold. Alas, they are accounted as earthen pots, work of a potter's hand. Destroyed, shattered, as if worthless. And so this is back, Echa B'nai Tzion, we're back to the single acrostic pattern, 22-line poem, Aleph through Tav. And then the fifth and last of the poems is surprisingly, startlingly, a poem that does not begin with the word Echa, and it is not an acrostic. However, it is a poem in 22 lines, suggesting the 22 letters of the Hebrew Aleph Bet. Now, what's the point of all of this acrostic stuff? Well, in English, you know, when we speak of trying to sum up everything, trying to cover the whole course of everything we want to discuss, we'll talk about going from A to Z. Well, in Hebrew, the equivalent would be Aleph through Tav. And so by making these poems an acrostic, the poet or poets, many scholars think that these are the works of not one poet, but perhaps several, maybe five, maybe one, maybe more than one. We don't know. We see the poet using the acrostic as a way of saying, I'm trying to sum up everything that we have suffered, everything that we've gone through, everything that we have endured. And the only way to do it is by saying Aleph through Tav. It's like A through Z. And by doing that, interestingly enough, the poet has a ready-made framework that allows the poet, or rather forces the poet, somehow to structure and control what could otherwise be uncontrollable grief, uncontrollable rage, uncontrollable outrage, exasperation, frustration, humiliation, all of that. And that is all expressed in the poem, but the structure of the poem allows for control, allows for shaping all of this into something that looks and sounds like and is in fact art. And maybe that's one of the saving messages of the poetry, which is with all this catastrophe, what survives? What survives is the capacity of a human being to take that suffering and express it in a coherent work of art, which does not diminish the suffering, but it preserves a record of it. And it's a savage record. Reading Echa, whether in translation or in the original, the original language is frequently obscure. It's not an easy read, even if one knows Hebrew well. You find that what is tough to read is this horrible chronicle of suffering, of persecution, of destruction, much of it characterized by a depiction of the city and its people as helpless. And the Lamentations poet, if you will, if I can use that as a catch-all term, the Lamentations poet often depicts the suffering city and its inhabitants as the vulnerable, oppressed widow. And in doing so, the Lamentations poet reminds us of all of those teachings in the Torah about the obligation to look out for the needs and the rights and to protect the rights of the widow, the orphan. And what is so awful, one of the things that's so awful about the scenes that are portrayed in Lamentations is that there's no pity whatsoever, no concern whatsoever for the children who are suffering, for the vulnerable, for the elderly, for the widows, for the women, young and old, who are vulnerable to all of the forms of violence. So what we recognize in Lamentations is that it is not only a record of the chronicles of a particular city and a particular group of people at a given time in history. It is the biblical and poetic expression of what happens in wartime, what happens in famine, what happens during exile. It is as relevant to things going on in Africa and the Near East and Ukraine and the Far East, South America. It's as relevant to all of that today as it is to Jerusalem centuries ago. When I've taught Lamentations to Christian divinity students and to Christian hospital chaplains, for example, hospice chaplains, one of the things that I hear often from them is, in Christian tradition, it's usually not considered acceptable to give voice to this kind of anger, this sense of being forsaken by God. That's like not having sufficient faith. And he said, and for the people that we deal with, they often say to me, the people we deal with, it is so necessary and affirming to have this kind of text to say, in the Bible, we do have this text called Lamentations, in which people who are suffering and feel that they are forsaken by God, that they've been given so many burdens and they have so much misery that they're suffering with, it's okay to express that. It is permissible to express that. And here's the kind of language that you can find in Lamentations that gives voice to that. Because, yeah, sometimes indeed, you say, well, I haven't been a perfect person. We haven't been a perfect society. We haven't always followed all of the religious laws and teachings that we should have, but so much misery, so much suffering, so much oppression. Were we really that bad? Did we do anything to deserve this, really? And this is what Lamentations gives us. This is one of the reasons why Lamentations is so important. And interestingly, of all of the books of the Bible, there are 3 that stand out for the extraordinary number of musical settings that they have received, particularly vocal settings, choral settings that they've received over the centuries. Psalms, of course. Song of Songs, because it says songs, and so Song of Songs, and Echa, Lamentations. And many of the musical settings come from Christian composers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in particular, though not exclusively. There have been others in modern times, like Stravinsky, who have set all or part of Lamentations in Latin translation, because they're working from the Christian translation of the Bible. And they turn it into music that is used in the church during Holy Week, the week leading up to Easter, for the Maundy Thursday, the Thursday night Tenebrae service, and for Good Friday. That is that period of time when Jesus is arrested and imprisoned and judged, and then is crucified. For the Christian church and for the Christian composers, that's their equivalent of the destruction of Jerusalem and the oppression and persecution of the Jewish people at the time of the Babylonians, the Babylonian captivity. One of the most remarkable settings that I know, by the way, is by the 16th century English composer with the interesting name of Thomas Tallis, Tallis, which seems to have no relationship whatsoever to the Talit. Where the name, what the origin of the name is, I don't really know. Thomas Tallis, for the Church of the Anglican Church in the 1560s, did a remarkable setting of Lamentations, in which one of the things that makes it most remarkable is that he sets the Hebrew letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, to music. And the most elaborate music in the whole composition is the music that he writes for these Hebrew letters. It's as if each of these letters is an opportunity for a musical meditation on the emotion of loss and suffering and grief. And then he goes into the text itself. It's quite an extraordinary project, but it shows the way in which this text can resonate even out of its immediate historical context and become a significant piece for the expression of suffering over, well, the Holocaust, for one thing, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the oppression of exiles. I mean, it's really a text about suffering under siege, about loss of your homeland, and everything that goes with that, the destruction of everything that you know, of family, of community. And the most precious thing, the next generation, the children. We can make a kind of, maybe I'll basically wrap up with this and one other observation. Well, I'll start with the observation first. And the observation is that after World War II, when a day and a liturgy were developed for Yom HaShoah, there were, and still are, lots of Orthodox Jews and lots of Orthodox rabbis who were basically opposed to the separate observance of Yom HaShoah. And their argument basically was, we already have a day in the Jewish calendar for observing and commemorating the sufferings of the Jewish people. It's Tisha B'Av, and Lamentations is our text for that. And we don't need a separate day for Yom HaShoah, because that seems to take this period and series of events that people are calling the Shoah or the Holocaust, and treating it as something different from every other disaster that has befallen us. And this argument goes, it really isn't. It fits into the lineage of all of our other sufferings. So there is that in some subset of the Jewish world, there is that feeling that this should be it, and the greatest literary text that we have for the observance of all of these disasters is indeed already was composed centuries ago. Another observation that I would make is that if Tisha B'Av is the low point in our liturgical year, a day that we observe in mourning, with the synagogue in darkness, the worshipers sitting on the floor or on low benches or stools as if they were mourners, the ark standing open with empty of the Torah scrolls, draped in black, as if the ark itself is in mourning. Sometime before the Talmudic era, a story, an idea, a legend, a kernel of something emerged in the myths of Judaism. And that teaching, which shows up in the Talmud and in Talmudic Midrash and in other Midrashic works, is that Tisha B'Av, the low point in Jewish history, is also the birthday. The 9th of Av is also the birthday of the Messiah. It's the birthday of the Messiah, which I think is a metaphorical way of saying that when we hit bottom, that when everything gets to be as bad as it can possibly be, then we get the rebound. God has already prepared the seed of renewal in, sort of planting that seed for the birth of the Messiah on this terrible, awful day of the 9th of Av, which of course this year is being observed on the 10th of Av, because the 9th falls on Shabbat. And we can't have that kind of gloom and suffering acknowledged on Shabbat, so we move it to after Shabbat ends, Tisha B'Av, the 10th, or rather on the 10th of Av. So there is a kind of pattern, I would say, and let me trace you through that pattern very briefly, and I'll conclude with this and then see whether there are any questions or comments or rebuttals or whatever. Basically, what happens in Eicha, in Lamentations, is a series of poems expressing the idea that we are devastated and desolate. And in these poems, we say, okay, it's our fault. Salachti, salachnu, not just I have sinned, but we have all sinned. We have sinned. It's all in the plural. It's our fault because we have sinned. So that's A and B. A, we're devastated. B, it's our fault because we've sinned. C is God has withdrawn protection from us and has sent savages to punish us. But then there's D. Yes, God has done all of that, but how can anything justify what we have suffered? Look at the Shoah, look at the Holocaust. Were people perfect before the Holocaust? No, but could that possibly justify what happens in the Shoah? Which leads to the next question, is there no mercy? Is there no compassion left from God or from human beings? Which then leads to Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha. Come back, draw us near to you again, God. Be close to us, and we shall be renewed and we shall be restored, which then leads, of course, to the Moshiach being born on Tisha B'Av. So, that I think is the possible, almost cyclical pattern, or at least spiral pattern of Tisha B'Av that is prepared for by Echa, and that last just glimmer of yearning for closeness and connection once again with God. So I'm going to stop there and see whether anybody has any sort of, I can stop sharing the screen, I think. See whether anybody has a question or a response.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about Mashiach and Tisha B'Av and that cycle, it occurred to me that the phoenix rising from its ashes is a very good metaphor for that. And that is also a good metaphor for the cyclical cycle of Judaic celebrations or commemorations, or, so there seems to be a circular symmetry in all of this.
Yeah, the phoenix rising from its ashes is very interesting. Of course, given the dynamics in Jewish belief and worship, one of the things that is taken for granted by the centuries of sages is that there's a providential God out there somewhere, and the phoenix just doesn't come of its own accord. We need to do something to establish a kind of to reestablish the uplink, if you will, or reestablish our worth as being the downlink for God. Yes, this was the people that I, the Lord your God, chose once upon a time, and I chose you because you were dear to me, and because of your behavior, you've lost that dearness. They, at any rate, back then, were not willing to say, well, God has vanished, God has disappeared, God is dead, God has withdrawn permanently from us. No, God is still there somewhere, and what we need to do somehow is find a way to make that connection once again. And it's also significant. We focus so much. I'm very resistant to the way in which the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem has become a focus of something almost approaching worship status. We put so much emphasis on Jerusalem, on the temple, on temple worship, on the Kotel. But one of the things that is fascinating to remember is that a great deal of Jewish history, a great deal of Jewish teaching, a great deal of Jewish religious law is dependent on what and on whom? The people who chose to stay in Babylonia. the ones who were taken into Babylon as captives were given, or the next generation were given the opportunity 50 years later. Okay, it's another generation, given the opportunity to return to Jerusalem. And they said, no, thank you very much. We like it here in Los Angeles. We like it, we like it in Boston. We like it in Chicago. We like it in New York. We like it in Atlanta. We like it in Virginia and North Carolina. Thank you very much. We're building a Jewish future here. And the ones who stayed in Babylonia, of course, became, centuries later, the ones who were the authorities of the Babylonian Talmud, for heaven's sake, and where would halakha be without the Babylonian Talmud? So the Jewish the Jewish history gives us a lot to think about in regard to the what the historian Salo Baron called the lachrymose reading of Jewish history. Seeing Jewish history as oive, pain and suffering. They tried to kill us. They didn't quite manage altogether. We could eat a little, but it's this depiction of Jewish history as the history of pain and suffering that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. So there's that, but then there's also the other view of Jewish history as adaptability. I mean, it is in a way ironic that the person whom I've been calling the Lamentations poet, the Echa poet, makes this extraordinary contribution not only to Jewish memory, not just Jewish history, but also Jewish memory, but also to Jewish art. By turning that suffering into self-contained works of art that suggests that, somehow those of us who survive do not have to be content with the dregs of culture. We can survive as a cultural people. We can take that pain and suffering and misery, and devastation, the destruction, the slaughter of children, of women, of elderly, of sages, and pious people. We can turn that into poetry that will make hundreds of generations of people understand and feel and suffer and sorrow and remember it all and say, oh, wasn't that terrible? Wasn't that a tragedy? And don't we see its image reflected over and over again in what people are experiencing and suffering and enduring today? That's that's a real achievement. Well, I hope this hasn't been a complete downer. For you.
No.
Tisha B'Av is I mean, one reason why Tisha B'Av is not so well observed as it might be is that, of course, it's in the height of summer, and you want to be sitting by the swimming pool with your gin and tonic in your bathing suit, and you don't want to think about fasting. You don't want to think about ashes and sackcloth and sitting on hard benches and so on. So there's that, but it is in contrast to Yom Kippur, which is a day of fasting, but it's what's usually called a white fast. It's a fast for purity. This is a fast for suffering, for lament, for feeling bad about yourself and about the state of the world, about the condition of Jews in the world. And yet, frankly, of all of the Megillot, all of the so-called scrolls, Echa has the most beautiful cantillation melodies of all of the Megillot. It has superb poetry, beautifully crafted, artful, and it can touch one's heart in a way that no other book of the Torah reaches in exactly the same way. Sefer Ruth, the book of Ruth, is touching and beautiful in other ways. Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, is beautiful in other ways. But the agony of grief fully comprehended and fully appreciated that we get to in Echa is something else. And it is, everybody who has suffered the loss of something dear to them and someone dear to them resonates with that opening motif of three of those books. Echa. You could say oy vey. You could say alas. And Echa as how is it? How come? Is also its own complaint. It's its own word of protest. You turn to the world, you turn to God and say, Echa, how is it that this is tolerable? How is it that this is bearable? How is it that this is a thing that human beings do to one another? How is it that this is a thing that human beings have to endure? Echa. It's whether one fasts or does not fast, whether one is sitting on the floor in grief, whether one's meal before Tisha B'Av is the traditional lentils and hard-boiled eggs of the mourner's meal, whether one does that or not. It is a time for deep and profound reflection and realization of something significant about our vulnerability and other people's vulnerability and other people's tsuris in the world. Their tsa'arat, their afflictions that we are called to be aware, not just to be aware of, but to respond to with sympathy, with compassion, with understanding, and to join our voices to theirs in complaint and in protest. Echa.
That's a pretty incredible presentation, Andrew. It really instills a deep appreciation for this text, both as poetry and also as something contemporary, which, a lot of times you might think, why should we care about reading something about the destruction of the synagogue or
right, and particularly if we're not looking with anticipation and delight to a third temple.
Right.
Why get all worked up over the destruction of the first or second one? Especially if we the Judaism, the Jewishness, the Jewish life that emerged as a consequence of the destruction of the second temple was the continuation of the temple worship. If we believe that, then why this fuss? But it taps into dimensions of human experience that I think are necessary for us to keep sight of. Along with the obligation to cry out, to give geschrei, what we say in give geschrei, give an exclamation of a cry of protest, complaint.
Oh, Rabbi Ettin, hi, it's Cynthia.
Hey, Cynthia,
And
yeah.
I just wanted to thank you. This was just phenomenal.
Mhm.
Thanks
I was
for being
just going to say that, but to answer your question of why bother is with the list of the other atrocities that have happened on the ninth of Av.
Yeah.
If our enemies think it's important enough to take other actions,
Mhm.
then shouldn't we be there in protest?
Mhm.
And
Right.
the whole, if
Good
you,
way of putting it. Showing up in protest. Exactly. And
because if you don't remember your history, you're doomed to relive it. And
yeah,
here we
and
go.
sometimes we relive it, even alas, even if we remember it. But
Yeah.
it's Seth raised the question as to whether we knew last time as to whether we knew exactly that it was the 9th of Av in each of these. Maybe we can say it's close enough. Close enough. If you believe in providential history, yes, then it was the 9th of Av, and it happened over and over and over again. But if not, it becomes the term a local habitation and a name. The 9th of Av becomes the local habitation and the name for these historical moments that happen sort of thereabouts, that become focused on, become the opportunity for us to funnel our historical experiences of suffering into a time and place and an observance that allows us to say, my heart grieves for this, and my soul is angry about it, and that calls me to recognize how others have suffered and are suffering, and for me to cry out and say, unjust. It's like not running in front of the leper to say unclean, but to run in front of those who are afflicted and suffering, to say unjust. What's happening here is unjust.
I'm not sure that I can say this in a way that's comprehensible, because it's not yet quite clear in my head, but it seems to me that some of what you said made me think that Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are almost mirror images or inverses
Right.
of each other.
Mhm.
And Yom Kippur is an opportunity where I reflect upon myself, and then I'm drawn on Yom Kippur into realizing I'm part of a whole group of people reflecting upon themselves, and we're a we and not an I.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
opposite with Tisha B'Av, which is, I wasn't there when that temple was destroyed. I wasn't there when that temple was destroyed. But it's an opportunity to look at shared communal grief and come from the whole to the part, as opposed from the part to the whole, if that makes any sense.
To me, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and perhaps the through line, the little bridge that connects the two of them is that verse Hashivenu,
which has both of those.
Which has both of those. It's
Yeah.
it's common to both, and it seems to be thrown out just before the end of Echa, just before the last line of Lamentations, as this one little hopeful bit. If I say things the right way to God, maybe God will help close this gap that has opened up. And on Yom Kippur, after we go through all of the Hashivenu of Elul and the recharging of renewal on Rosh Hashanah, we have the opportunity on Yom Kippur to really make a repair.
And I think both of them are a concrete example of a covenant being a mutual, you can't have a fight with somebody who's not fighting with you. You can't have a covenant unless the other side wants to be covenantal. And that's in the Hashivenu, bring us back to you, and we will return to you. If you be our God, we will be your people, which brings us back again to the beginning.
Yes, indeed, and brings us back to we're B'nai Yisrael, so that takes us back Yisrael, Jacob, saying to God, if you bring me back safely, if you bring me back safely to my home and bring me back prosperous to my home, then you will be my God. It is a covenantal relationship. It does require two parties for its completion. Really does. Lovely. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. This has been very good.
Oh, I appreciate you all being here.
Andrew, it's an exceptional presentation, really.
Thanks, Mike.
And learned a lot, and always appreciate your willingness to share your expertise and your knowledge with the community.
Thank you for arranging it, and thank all y'all for being from
I want to say
3 different communities at least represented here.
On Saturday evening, Rabbi Charlie will be holding a Tisha B'Av service. So if anyone's interested, I think it begins at 8:00. So that is what this discussion and the discussion by Jeff Lerner kind of been building up towards. So I hope some of you can make it after that as well.
Yeah, I'll still be on the West Coast.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably live streamed, so if you wanted it, you could probably get it.
Probably, yeah. If you can make it in person, Tisha B'Av is one of those services that's very difficult to get live streamed. I mean, it can be live streamed. Experience of it is something else.
I will depart with the Southern version of Hashivenu. You all come back now, you hear?
You hear?
Thank you.
Thank you all for
sir.
being here. And then,
Thank you, sir.
Andrew, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you for arranging it.